Welcome, Manuel Eisner, Professor of Criminology at the University of Cambridge, Director of the Institute of Criminology, founding member of the European Society of Criminology, and Marcelo Aebi, Professor of Criminology in Lausanne and Executive Secretary of the European Society of Criminology. So I welcome you to the Oral History project of the ESC.
It's my pleasure.
While preparing for this interview, I was watching you as an interviewer doing the interview to Michael Torney for this same series. Yeah? So I took a couple of questions from that interview, and the one to break the ice is what brought you into criminology?
Well, two things that come to mind. One is my family background, which brought me into specializing into violence. My family comes from, on both sides, from a Jewish background, and so I grew up in a completely non-religious household. There was nothing about religion, but there was this section in the bookshelf on the Holocaust and concentration camps and the history of Germany during the World War II. And when I studied history, which was my first subject, my very first seminar was on a topic related to Jews during during the interwar period, and so I got interested in this question about where violence is coming from. So that is one reason that brought me into criminology. The other is much more kind of like a coincidence. I had studied my second year as undergraduate student at UCL in London, and I came back from London not knowing where to stay, and a friend of mine said, oh, there is this advert in Zurich for a flat which is advertised by a self-help organization of people who have come out of prison. And they want to have one flat for students in order to kind of like support socialization and integration and so on. And so we both thought, this is very exciting, this is interesting. And so I lived there for a year. To this day, I'm not quite sure who socialized whom, but that's a different question. So I think these were two main factors that came together. The staying, I should say here that staying at the center for a year, learning about the lives of people who've come out of prison, then led me to do my master's dissertation on a topic that kind of like brought this together with my degree in history. And so I did my master's thesis on the link between economic business cycles and levels of crime in the canton of Zurich. Kind of like classical topic of criminology, business cycles, economic crisis, economic growth, and crime levels, and I combined crime levels with divorce rates and kind of like in the tradition of moral statistics, bring together a number of different indicators and try to better understand how they all relate to each other.
Okay, perfect. So you mentioned London, Zurich. Perhaps we should start by fixing a timeline, the timeline of your life. So let's start from the beginning. You were born in Bern, Switzerland. Eh?
I was born in Bern. Then my family moved to Zurich when I was 7. And I grew up just outside Zurich, where I also did my gymnasium, and then started to go to University of Zurich. And then I did my second year, as I mentioned, in London, which was quite exciting. This was 1979, 1980, so it was when Margaret Thatcher had just come to power. It was also interesting politically to see all the changes. It was a country in crisis. And for somebody coming from Switzerland, a very protected environment, it was just very, very interesting and exciting to see a very different way of living. And I was living in East London, which was very, very different from my previous experiences. So in 1985, I finished my master's thesis, and then I got a position as a research assistant at the University of Zurich. It was based on a project that I had actually received funding from the National Science Foundation. It had something about crime in it, but it was not about crime itself. My PhD thesis was about political language, the history of political language in Switzerland. I did this analysis of kind of like hegemonic political discourses over the last 150 years using some content analysis. But then I brought into play crime indicators because I was interested in the crime indicators as kind of like a proxy for social instability. And so the suspicion was that in periods of social instability, you would get a higher propensity for political actors to change the way they define and interpret the world. That was what I did. I had the PhD accepted in 1991. And then, as you know, in Switzerland you have to do a second PhD, the Habilitation, which gives you the permission to lecture. It doesn't give you a job, it just gives you the permission to teach. And there was a moment when I thought, well, I actually did go into the private sector just briefly, but in the end, again, I was fortunate to get some funding for a project that was then really criminological. And it was a project on the change of urban structures and levels of violent crime, which then became a published book, which became quite... it was called, at the time, the title of the book is Das Ende der zivilisierten Stadt, the end of the civilized city. It was very, looking back at it, it's so interesting because at the time, also in the United States, you had all these catastrophic titles that came out of criminology, that things are, we're seeing the beginning of the next generation of ultra predators and all these things. And so because everybody was expecting that you can just continue the trend of the past and then, you get a good prediction of what's going to happen in the future. And this was the mid-1990s, everybody was talking about increasing crime, and then I wrote this book, and then all of a sudden crime started to go down in Switzerland as well, which was, as we both know, a bit of a surprise, and nobody had expected it. But nonetheless, the book was quite a success, and basically what it was in the tradition of social ecology, but also going into more situational routine activity approaches, developing some detailed maps of hotspots of violent crime in Basel, which is stuff that nobody had done before, and that led me then to that this was then accepted and published in 1995, and that was the year, I think, when I came to Lausanne. And did a year of teaching in Lausanne in French. And in the meantime, I had changed in Zurich. I changed from the University of Zurich to the ETH, the Federal Institute of Technology. And I was assistant professor and then associate professor in the ETH until I came to
Cambridge. Which year, more or less?
It was 2000.
2000.
So, and it was, Mike Tunry, I think, called me in the autumn of 1999. I was initially just, the position was vacant because a colleague had taken unpaid leave, and so it was just for 1 year or 2 years to come to Cambridge on a non-established basis. In some ways it was very welcome to me because I thought, well, first of all, just getting a call from Michael Tunry is quite a thing. And I still remember Michael Tunry saying on the phone, well, you probably don't know who I am, but I'm Michael Tunry calling from the Institute of Criminology. And I still remember that I said, yes, of course I know who you are, but I had no clue who he was, actually. And so anyways, we had this conversation, and he asked me to come to Cambridge, and I thought this was a clever strategic move at the time to get a position in Zurich. This was the idea. So going away for a year or two to a prestigious university would open the career path to apply for an established position in Zurich.
Ah, nice. Nice strategical thinking. Yeah,
it's nice strategical thinking, but completely useless. I was never successful in Zurich.
But you never know, you may come back.
Yeah, you never know.
You never know. So, you mentioned teaching in French in 1995. I missed you for 1 year because I started the master in 1994 and you came the other year.
Right.
So, teaching there in French, you were teaching in German, perhaps in Swiss German, in Zurich, then you go to teach in English at Cambridge. This relationship with the languages, which is, I would say, the typical of Swiss citizens. So when we are confronted to these different languages, how do you feel about teaching in different languages? Was it useful for you? Or in which way it was useful?
I think mostly it was terrible and terrifying. I mean, it's hard enough to just have a daily conversation in a foreign language. But then, if you try to teach in a language that you're not at home in, it becomes so much more difficult because, on the one hand, it's easy because some technical terms are just the same across different languages or similar across different languages. But so much of the teaching depends on the spontaneity of you being able to express yourself, to formulate your thoughts as you think, unless you have a script, of course, but I never worked with a script as for my own teaching. And so this kind of like trying to come across with one's own ideas in a foreign language, I find terribly hard, certainly at the beginning. And I still remember coming back from my teaching in Lausanne on a Friday evening, and I was completely exhausted. And the same is true in Cambridge the first few years. It took quite a while until it became something that I felt comfortable with.
Okay, and now that, let's say, German and English are your daily, both your languages, is it useful for you to change languages when you are working on an idea, or when you publish in another language, changing the language, does it change the way in which you see the problem?
I think there are different levels here. One is, almost everything I publish these days is in English. And I would even find it difficult these days to teach in German, I think. I haven't done this for quite a while. And it's when I go back to Switzerland and I give a talk, I realize it's become alien after a while. It just becomes something more difficult. I think talking in different languages, as a European criminologist, it's just something that is very, very important. And I've taken this, partly it is something that Martin Kilias, I think, always emphasized, and I've taken away from Martin, that this is part of what we are about as European criminologists, being able to, and interested in, and benefiting from engaging with people in different languages.
Okay, so the sort of language Heimatlos, probably there is a better word in German, your homeland, which is your language, finally, is a mix of all that. Your daily life, what do you do with your kids?
Well, so with my kids, whenever we are on our own, we speak Swiss German. With my wife, in the meantime, for instance, when I message my wife, we speak English.
And she's Swiss.
She's Swiss as well. Yeah. But of course, well, all three of my kids have English-speaking or non-German-speaking partners. And so as soon as there is a bigger family, it automatically converges to English.
I'm always fascinated by this relationship with the languages. And where do you see your retirement? In Switzerland or in the UK?
Well, people ask me these questions now and again. I think we will stay in England. We will stay in the UK. It's less a question of staying in the UK, it's really a question of staying in Cambridge and staying in the place where you're at home. And after 25 years, that's where we are at home, where we have our friends, where we feel, where our home is. And
the Heimat.
The Heimat. And I think after 25 years, Ruth, my wife, and I have had these conversations that after 25 years, one can think about going back, but it isn't really going back. It's going to a different place where one starts something new again, and one needs to be quite clear that this is not as easy as one might imagine it is.
These histories of migration are always incredible. Let's focus a little bit on your research. So when I look at your biography published in the website of Cambridge Institute, my academic work revolves around the explanation of the causes, the consequences, and the prevention of international violence across human society. So you mentioned how you arrived there, but then you started developing a huge database that is now available. How all this came together? But perhaps Michael Tonry has something to do there also, because he was the one who found Robert Gere in the 1980s.
Yes. Michael Tonry has something to do with it. I had read the article by Tetko before I came to Cambridge. I knew about his work and about this famous article in Crime and Justice where he plots this trend of homicide from the Middle Ages onwards. And being a historian, I had read some other pieces and I realized, okay, there's some other bits of research that has produced these observation points that are not included in this graph. And so I thought, well, okay, let's see where they fit into the pattern. And I thought, this looks quite interesting, but I had no experience, very little experience with publishing research, and I wasn't sure whether that was of interest to anybody out there in the world. And so this is where Michael Tonry came into play, and Michael said, well, this sounds very interesting, this sounds really fascinating, so you should work more on that. And so I think that it was his encouragement to some extent that actually made me spend more time thinking about this, writing then, publishing the paper in the British Journal of Criminology, and then in Crime and Justice.
And then you also studied the regicides, the killings of kings.
Yes.
How did this arrive when you were looking for sources?
Well, the regicide project was a little bit a crazy Sunday morning idea. So I think we were sitting, the entire family was sitting around the table, and I said to my kids, or I just said, well, who knows how many English kings had been murdered, and we didn't know the answer to that question. And so I thought, well, okay, let's try to find this out. And so at the time already there were, you could look this up on Wikipedia, and you have the list of all monarchs of England, and you just count them. And I thought, okay, I know something about counting things. Let's try to count this for other places. And then I asked my kids whether they would be interested to help me. And so they started, I gave them my coding instructions, I developed coding instructions. So at some stage the entire family was helping me with coding regicides. And so that's where this project came from.
A wonderful story. And let's talk about the explanations, because that robot girl, he somehow recovered Elias, or Elias to be. But then you, at the beginning, the first article in the British Journal, you are closer to Elias than you are later, where you go more closer to Weber, but maybe you can explain that.
Yes. I think, so when I started really, as you rightly say, when I started, TETCO had very much worked on the basis of Norbert Elias. I was a big fan, and I still am a big fan of Norbert Elias's work. I had the great privilege to actually listen to him once when he gave a talk in Zurich, and I found this absolutely fascinating. They were part of this Norbert Elias revival in the 1980s, and so I thought that's a really helpful framework. Which, by the way, to some extent, I still think the entire idea of monopolization of violence, so state-building processes contributing to the pacification of space in society is important. Also, Norbert Elias's idea of this, of this idea of interdependence leading to pacification, which is effectively an older idea of Enlightenment philosophy. This idea of sweet commerce. But when I wrote, I think Norbert Elias at the same time has some important limitations. And I think one of them is his idea, which comes from Sigmund Freud, this idea that these medieval psychologists were kind of like almost childish, kind of like lacking any kind of like self-control and having all this lack of control over body fluids and lack of self-control over sexual activities and so on. And it's simply not true. I mean, first of all, I think it's important to bear this in mind. I also thought that I discovered, as I was developing more spatial variation, as I could identify more spatial variation in the decline of homicide rates, I thought, something doesn't quite fit here, because Norbert Elias had quite clear ideas who were the pioneers of state building, the pioneers of the absolutist state that controls people's lives, and of course the pioneers were France but the decline in homicide happened to some extent in places that had relatively limited state. The absolutist project in England failed, and there was never, there was more bureaucracy, but it failed. Germany, there was a lot of small states, state structures, but the German Reich was nothing, it was unimportant. Switzerland as well. So why was there a decline of homicide rates in these places that didn't have effective monopolistic overarching state power? And that's where Max Weber comes into play, and this idea of, first of the city as an important source of civilizing processes, the city as a community of the European city, which he emphasizes, the European city as places that quite uniquely develop their own political identity, try to problem solve, try to develop their own judicial processes, try to establish mechanisms of social control. And the second process that I emphasized was the rise of modern individualism as a source of a civilizing process. So not so much state control, but more so, I mean, if you think about sociology, more so in the tradition of Tönnies, the transition from Gemeinschaft to Gesellschaft, Max Weber's idea of modern individualism as a source of a sense of responsibility, as a transition towards a sense of moral obligation that's no longer an obligation to the collective, which leads to things like feuding, to collective revenge, to a more individualistic sense of just being responsible morally to one's own behavior and being guided by one's own sense of moral rightness. Does that make sense?
It makes sense, of course, and perhaps this allows us to go from these explanations, which are mainly of violence, to theories in criminology. I will tell you what I think, so you have some idea to confront. So most of the theories try to explain delinquency, crime, the big definition that includes all types of crime. Basically, I'm simplifying because of this idea that delinquents, offenders are versatile and they commit different types of offending. My own research when I was studying drug-addicted offenders in Switzerland, very engaged in delinquency, was that even the most active ones, they have a kind of a specialization. I mean, if you look with general indexes like lifetime prevalence, yes, they all committed different crimes, but they have a kind of specialization. So, in my opinion, many of the main theories in criminology, by mixing all types of offenses, trying to find an explanation for delinquency or crime in general, are missing a little bit the point, and they don't leave space to something that is developed in Cambridge a lot, which is the neurosciences, which in my opinion are a little bit closer to violence. But so I would like to have your idea about this.
So, a number of things on that. I find it quite fascinating that at the level of individual analysis, individual life course of offending, as you were saying, the overwhelming pattern that people find empirically is generality rather than specialization. And with some tendency towards specialization, mainly in a number of different ways. There is some tendency towards violent versus property crime, then there is this subgroup of sexual offending, and then there is this pattern that some specialization occurs at certain stages over the life course. So there is kind of like, if you happen to be in a youth gang, you would do different things than once you are somewhere in a leading position in an organization. So where you are in your life course, in your life circumstances changes. But, and that's the interesting thing, in my view, when you look at this more at the macro level of comparison between societies, all of a sudden you see that societies with high levels of property crime are not necessarily societies with high levels of homicide. Because, for instance, firearms play a role. Situational factors play a role in what is happening in terms of crime. And so it seems to me almost that we need to think about this as a multi-level problem. What can we see when we use individuals as a unit of analysis? And what can we see when we look at entire societies as units of analysis?
Okay, and the last question about this, also I have the impression, that, it's not an impression, but most of the testing of theories has been done with juveniles, because it's easy to do self-report delinquency studies. Are these theories valid for grown-ups, let's say, for adults?
Well, so far, I want to use this question as an opportunity to say something briefly about this other big project that I'm working on. So I'm not just, one area of research is this of passion and research is a longitudinal study in Zurich, which is a study of 1,500 people that we recruited into the study in 2003 at age 7 when they started primary school, and we've just celebrated 20 years of that study. So we have data collections at ages 7, 8, 9, 11, 13, 15, 17, 20, 24, and now we're looking towards the data collection at age 28. And we're now also starting to collect data for the third generation of our study participants. So we have the parents, we have the study participants, and now we have the children of the study participants. So these data allow us to say something about the relevance of criminological theories for explaining crime and delinquency at different ages. And based on those data, the overwhelming impression that I get is that the patterns of associations are very similar across age. There's some changes as well. During adolescence, peer groups play an absolutely critical role, but that's been known for a long period of time. As people go into adulthood, these peer groups play a lesser role in the motivation of crime and offending. There are limits to the extent to which we can analyze these things, because unfortunately for a criminologist in Zurich, by age 24, most offending has stopped. It declines very, very steeply. Similar in many ways to patterns in other societies, in some ways also different. One of the groups that we can't find so far, and I find this interesting from a comparative perspective, is the lifetime persistent offenders. So Terry Moffat, as you will know, had this hypothesis that there is one particularly problematic group of lifetime offenders that start very early, continue to offend throughout adolescence, and then continue to offend in adulthood. Some American studies, many American studies have replicated this finding, that there is this group of about 4 or 5% of life-course persistent offenders, and we can throw whatever trajectory model we like at the Zurich data. We can't find the life-course persistent offender group.
That's a major result.
That's an interesting result, yes.
Because it also shows the other limitation is that most theories come from the Anglo-Saxon world, and you have the advantage of being with this, because you kept somehow one leg in Zurich. You have a research team in Zurich working on this. Tell me.
Yes, but so okay. No, I've actually answered. I think I've answered your question. I just wanted to say briefly something about the Zerposa study, because I think that's probably also characterizes a little bit the way I'm trying to do criminology. Namely as very much an interdisciplinary endeavor. And so in the Zerposa study, we collected data right from the beginning, after consultations with the Löbers and Richard Tremblay and many of the famous criminologists in the early 2000s. We designed a study that was focused on violence and aggression, but then also right from the beginning included a lot of measures on ADHD, on prosocial behavior, on internalizing anxiety and depression. So we tried to quite broadly capture different dimensions, different aspects of childhood, adolescent development and psychopathologies as they develop over time. And that has led to this very enriching study where we, as I told you last week, I came back from Bari, and we had 36 7 participants from all kinds of disciplines. And people do research on ADHD, they do research on suicide, they do research on sexual identity, and a lot of research now is going on substance use. Zurich has these very, very elevated levels of cocaine use. So everybody who's specializing in substance use really loves our data set, because we have this unique, no other study that I'm aware of has something like, I think, 20% prevalence rate of cocaine use. And so, they really like this, and we now have, so we're working, and we have particularly interesting data on that, because we started at age 20 to collect hair samples. So we're working with pharmacologists, and we take hair samples of all the study participants, and then they're being chopped up, and they can analyze about 200 different substances in people's hairs, so we can validate the self-reports data, and we have actual biological data on substance consumption over the last 3 months. What I wanted to say here is that I think in my own thinking about criminology, we should always aim to engage with other disciplines and work together. I find this terribly enriching and fascinating to work with neuroscientists, to work with political scientists, to work with historians, to work across the entire range of sciences of humans, and use this knowledge to understand norms and law and consent.
I'm very happy that you mentioned Zurich also, because as you are also a sociologist, maybe you can give us a little bit your idea of how the Swiss society has changed over these 30 years. I was looking at the results of the sample of the latest self-reported delinquency study, the I-34, and roughly 1/3 of the kids had only one passport, the Swiss passport. 1/3 had the Swiss passport plus another, and another third did not have a Swiss passport. How was Zurich, Zurich, you know, since it was 7, how did the city change? Is the most important city, the capital, let's say, of Switzerland somehow. Which is your regard as a sociologist of this change in the society?
Yeah. Well, I have too many book projects in my head. But one project that I would like to do is to write a book about this Z-Prosa cohort and what it tells us about urban life in Zurich. And the reason for this is that in our cohort, similar to what you're saying, in our cohort, about 35% of the study participants have 2 parents who are born in Switzerland. 65%, the majority of our study participants are second generation immigrants, if you will. So they are parents who were not born in Switzerland. And they come from many, many different places. In Zurich, it's not the case that there is one dominant immigrant minority, different from, for instance, from Basel, where you have a large Turkish background community. In Zurich, it's a mix of Sri Lanka. The biggest minorities are various areas, Serbian, Kosovo. So let me go back. This cohort is very much influenced by the various civil wars in the early 1990s and the refugee movements of that period coming into Switzerland. Then the children are born in the around 1996, and then they go to school in 2003. And so we have quite an interesting cohort in terms of migration history. And we're doing some analysis on how this shapes the trajectories of these children. But probably most fascinating for me from a macro perspective is that for some reasons, neither in our data nor I think in Zurich as a city, one can see the kinds of persistent marginalization of immigrant communities that one can see in some other cities. So overall, it would be interesting to use such a book also to assess, critically assess, one, what went well with integration policies at the school levels, at the societal level, at the neighborhood level, what did not go well, and how can such longitudinal studies illuminate what we might improve in terms of integration policies.
Okay, so we have to wait for the book to have the answer, but I think it's quite interesting because Switzerland is seldom looked, many people look at Sweden, and you see what's happening now in Sweden. I think Switzerland has a lot to talk, and you have the key there because you have the data.
Yes,
You
yeah.
have the longitudinal data. There is the Swiss household survey, but the questions are not the same.
No.
Okay, let's talk a little bit about the Society of the European Society of Criminology. You are one of the founding fathers of this society. Which is your reflection? Next year it will be 25 years. We'll be celebrating that. Which is your view of the society? Whatever you want to tell about the society, don't feel constrained by what my question.
It was quite funny. Before this interview, I ran into a colleague of mine, and I said, "Good to meet you." And he made a comment saying, "Well, but you haven't always been to the European Society of Criminology meetings." And I said, "No, that's true." I said, "Well, there were some years where I rather went to the American Society of Criminology meetings, but sometimes I go to both. But I think my own kind of like emotional, if you will, pathway has been that I've rediscovered the unique achievements of the European Society of Criminology. And over the last few years, I just found it a fantastic place to be, and something that just this sense that we are in Europe have developed, through the society have developed our own sense of what European societies are doing, are trying to achieve with respect to crime and justice. It's quite amazing, and there is this enriching sense going through the seminars, going through the workshops, the sessions here or last year or the previous year, that we are developing our own language. I think we're developing our own communities of knowledge, and so I find this quite extraordinary.
Okay, when in the discussion with Michael Tonry, you asked him about his perception of gender issues in the Society of Criminology, but I don't want this to be a trap, the question, so right. I must say that on Sunday we will have the new board, the elected members, so Michelle Bullman will be the president, Josep Maria Tamarit as president, Ana Guetos elected president, and in the board we have Ana Di Ronco, Ineke Jaén Marshall, and Marieke Kluin. So 5 women, 1 man. So we can now go back to your question. What is your perception of gender issues in the Society of Criminology, and perhaps why you asked the question several years ago, and how this changed during that time?
I have no idea why I asked this question 7 years ago. But it might well have been motivated at the time more by the perception that at the time the higher levels of the society were dominated by men. Do I perceive an issue now? No, not really.
So I think that this change alone, Michael Torrey gives an answer saying, okay, at that time, for my generation, you will find one woman out of 20 men.
Yeah,
and this change, and this came without major challenges, let's say. Yeah? And you tell me that we have 5 minutes, so let's talk a little bit about your work with the international organizations, because you collaborated with United Nations, UNICEF. Which is that you're doing there? I know you have a plan for reducing violence. Eh?
Yes. So, the two topics here that I was and continue to be interested in. Through already in the 1990s, I was involved in some work with the European Council, and then through Chris Micton, I got involved with the World Health. Chris Micton was a PhD student at Cambridge, and then went to work at WHO in Geneva, worked with the Violence Reduction Prevention Unit in Geneva together with Alex Butchart. And of course, when you do violence research, the World Health Organization Global Violence Report in, what was it again, 1991? Maybe, I can't remember exactly. This is the landmark report, and it's kind of like with Etienne Krug as the first author. This was the first time ever that an international organization put violence on top of the agenda, and the WHO pioneered the idea of violence being something that can be changed through political means. And so they put it into their public health agenda, and to this day this remains one of their priorities. And I think it's really interesting, and they taught me a lot, to work with WHO on public health approaches to reducing violence. And so in 2014, through funding received by the Optimus Foundation, I organized together with the World Health Organization this global conference, which was under the label, which at the time I thought was very ambitious. What do we need to do to reduce violence across the world by 50% over 30 years? That was kind of like the framework, and I just wanted to focus the minds of researchers through this question, because as you know, as researchers, we like to make predictions, but we like to make predictions for the past and not for the future, and so also as researchers, we find it really difficult. We all write something about implications, policy implications, into the conclusions of our papers. Usually these conclusions are relatively empty and not specific and not committing to anything. And so I wanted academics to come together for 3 days and say, what are your suggestions actually? What do we have to do? So this was 2014, and then 2015 the Sustainable Development Goals came out with this even more ambitious goals of eliminating all violence against women, eliminating all violence against children, and so on and so forth. So I think in my own thinking, this global vision of what actually drives, like your interest in crime trends, what drives these ups and downs of levels of violence, and is there anything that we can do with the means of politics to change these things, is in my view, a really fascinating and important question. What is the role of prevention policies, and not just prevention, but also criminal justice policies, in reducing and changing levels of crime? Because some of for instance, what was the role of the Italian state's change in policies towards the mafia after the big wave of murders in changing levels of mafia activity? I think that's a really important question. I think often in criminology we don't really have systematic answers to, how important were the policy changes and what general knowledge can we derive from that and address it. So this is one topic that still keeps me fascinated. And then a few years ago I tried to combine this, which is one of my failed projects. I'll finish with the failed project. It didn't, so I thought, okay, can I think of something really ambitious to do? And so I thought, I would like to initiate a global longitudinal study. And the idea was to bring together my interest in the micro level, what determines individual lives, together with my interest in orbital layers and the macro level and these big crime trends. And I said, well, if we want to bring this together, we need to have a study design that looks a little bit like a Hadron Collider in Geneva, a big science structure that compares how young people grow up in very different structural environments. And so the idea was 12,000 children growing up primarily in the global south in different societies that are characterized by very different institutional contexts. And so we again got some funding from a number of foundations. It was at the time primarily the Botnar Foundation that in Basel that gave us research funding to work with colleagues in 7 cities. So we wanted to focus on cities. This topic of cities comes back here because I think cities are interesting in terms of violence prevention, because influencing something at the national level is very difficult. Medium-sized cities, that's what we wanted to go for. That's where you have communities of politicians and stakeholders that you can actually talk to. And so we had Kingston in Jamaica, we had Koforidua in Ghana, we had a city in South Africa, we had Romania, we had Cluj in Romania, we had a city in Pakistan, we had a city in Sri Lanka, and a city in the Philippines. And we actually made it to the stage of testing the entire study with a sample of 150 participants, but then taking it to scale and doing this with the sample size that we actually wanted to achieve. That's where it would have cost a lot of money. It would have been very interesting to do, but we never got there.
But it's good.
Yeah, it could still happen, but it would happen not with me being the PI.
Okay, then for the closing remark. We are recording this in September 2024 in Bucharest. I would have loved, for example, to hear now what Sutherland was saying in 1924. Mm-hmm. Suppose that 100 years from now, someone keeps this recording and watches. What would be the questions that you would, or at least one question that you would ask to this future criminologist?
I would be curious to know how, in 100 years, they're thinking about the problem of the tension between human liberty and freedom and control. Because I think that here is the reason why. What I seem to be seeing is that we're moving towards a society where we have ever-increasing levels of technological control over every aspect of our lives. Every place that we go to is monitored and controlled, it's visible. And of course we have similar changes, it's kind of like it's again with criminals and who also develop technological innovation. But the entire problem of how much control will there be, and how can we deal with the risks of totalitarian control, and where will we be with respect also to new developments with artificial intelligence regarding this old idea that is behind so much of criminology, namely that humans are, at least to some extent, responsible, free beings that make decisions about what is right and what is wrong.
Okay. Manuel Eisner, or Peter Manuel Eisner, to quote your full name, thank you very much for giving us this interview.
A pleasure. Thank you.